As the First World War reached a stalemate on the Western Front, in the Middle East there was still movement. Like in the winter of 1915-16, the Russians prepared to make a move into Turkey. The Ottomans didn't believe there would be an offensive in the winter months, so they were caught completely off guard, and they quickly lost Erzurum and Trabzon. There, many of the Armenian survivors were able to return home. Also along the borders and Kurdish lands, the people began to grow worried about Ottoman rule, believing that they could be targeted next after the Armenians. The Russians therefore set up some links with their leaders, promising them independence after occupation. So around Dersim, Ali Aga rose up. Among the Kurds there had been a small growth in nationalism prior to the war, with the formation of the Kurd Society for Cooperation and Progress. This group was founded by the son of the Emir, Ali Beder Khan. Other founders included an old rebel leader, Sheikh Abdul Qadir, and Sharif Pasha, who was exiled before the war and continued to condemn the Young Turks. But they were still divided along tribal lines, and many continued to align themselves with the Ottomans. Like a prominent theologian named Said Nursi, was captured by the Russians, and in Russian captivity he created the Nur movement, which tried to defend the Islamic religion through education, art and unity. On the ground though, the Ottomans quickly countered, and in April began driving the Kurdish rebels back. They finally surrendered in early May, and many of the tribes that had taken part in the rebellion were deported. Talat Pasha then ordered most of the civilian population to be dispersed in Turkish villages and among Turks. The deportation of Kurds would continue long after the war, and they would continue to rise up, like around Kigli and then in 1917 in Botan. They, however, had very little support, so by the end of the war up to half of the Kurdish populations either died on the front lines or were deported. But first I'd like to thank Aura for sponsoring this video. Are you tired of constantly receiving spam phone calls to the point where you don't even answer your phone anymore? Well, Aura is here to help. Data brokers are making a fortune selling your information to robocallers, spammers and others who want to learn more about you, like where you live. Well, Aura can identify data brokers exposing your info and submit opt-out requests on your behalf. These brokers are actually legally required to remove your information if you ask them to, they just make it incredibly hard to do so. So, Aura will do it for you. It's really easy to set up, and you can get it for an incredibly reasonable price. So let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online, while you get on with your life. Don't let people continue exploiting and profiting from your private information. Go to aura.com/Jabzy. There, if you're from the USA, you can start your 2-week free trial today. And you can take a look if your personal information has been compromised. Again, that's aura.com/Jabzy. But now, let's get back to the video. The Entente was more focused elsewhere, and 1916 also saw the signing of possibly one of the most controversial agreements in history, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. To put this into some sort of context though, partitioning defeated empires was common, as Russia, Austria, Bulgaria and Germany would all be partitioned, and Enver Pasha joined the First World War and declared a jihad, with the hope of partitioning enemy empires himself. So, as soon as the Turks attacked Russia, Sergei Sazonov laid claims to Istanbul. Even back in 1908 they demanded a home for the Russian fleet whence she can move to the Mediterranean, the Baltic and the Far East, as necessity may require. However, Greece at this time was neutral, but they were willing to provide bases for the Entente in return for Istanbul. However, the Russians of course wouldn't allow this. So Russian claims were solidified with the Constantinople Agreement of 1915. Then the French had been slowly developing claims on Syria and Lebanon, where they long had alliances with the Maronites and began constructing railway lines. In fact, back in 1913, the Germans and the French agreed to divide their spheres of economic activity, with France keeping to Lebanon, Syria and the surrounding regions, including Iskenderun. In Britain, Edward Grey said, "Turkey's independence is a vanishing quantity before the advance of French financiers." And Mark Sykes gave a speech in Parliament condemning the concessions given by the Turks in exchange for huge loans. Plus, for a few years prior to the war, the French were beginning to receive reports from the likes of Professor Tissot that Mosul would be a key oil-producing region. So Delcasse sent French claims to London and Rome. Italy by this point still hadn't joined in the war, yet they could be enticed to join the Entente if they were promised land. So to entice the Italians to join their side, the Entente signed the Treaty of London. In it was said, the Mediterranean region bordering on the province of Italia, within the limits indicated above, shall be reserved to Italy. The French also claimed land south of the Baghdad railway line, leaving Russia to the north. But Del Casse wrote Britain would want the Tigris and Euphrates region right up to the northern frontiers of Mesopotamia. France also claimed Konya and Adana, along with parts of Iraq. Mosul was up for debate. Diyarbakir, however, was, in the words of diplomat Paul Cambon, inhabited by a bunch of wild thieving bandits, so it should be left alone. They then invited the British to talks, but Edward Grey said that the British had not yet had time to consider our desiderata, and he added there must, in the interests of Islam, be an independent Muslim political unit somewhere else. Where this would be, however, was still open for debate. Some, like Mark Sykes, began to argue that Britain should stake a claim far north in Iraq, right up to Mosul to exploit the oil. But, as of yet, no real claims came forward. There were those that claimed Britain needed to claim more land early on, like Kitchener, who believed Russia and France were only temporary allies, saying old enmities and jealousies, which may have been stilled by the existing crisis in Europe, may revive. But at the beginning of the war, Asquith was the Prime Minister, and he was a proponent of forcing reforms upon a united Turkish Empire. But then, in 1916, Lord George took over, and he was far more keen on dividing up the empire. But possibly one of the most important men at that time was Muhammad Sharif al-Faruqi, an Ottoman prisoner of war that defected to Britain. He claimed to have ties to the Sharif of Mecca, and began to claim to be an important leader of the Al-Had group, which promoted Arab independence. He said he had nearly 10,000 members, many of which were in the Ottoman army, all ready to support the British. But in reality, they only had around 53 members. Nevertheless, many of the British believed him. For instance, Gilbert Clayton, the director of military intelligence in Cairo, called him a leading spirit in the Pan-Arab Party. Also, before his arrival in British custody, the British didn't necessarily look solely at the Sharif of Mecca as the natural leader of an Arab state, and they had dealings with many other leaders. But al-Faruqi told the British stories of tens of thousands of men ready to fight for the Sharif. More importantly, he met with Mark Sykes, and claiming to have spoken with the Sharif, he said that they had agreed to French claims in Syria and British claims in Iraq. Sykes, believing this to be true, incorporated it into his agreement. Al-Faruqi also created a sense of urgency. Not only did he say that the Arabs in Syria were waiting for British troops landing on the coast, but he also said that the Germans were already talking to the Sharif and were poised to sign an agreement of their own. So he pushed the British to move quick. This is when Sykes and Picot met to discuss what should happen to the Middle East. Picot demanded that the French should also get Palestine, all of Cilicia, and lands east into Kirkuk and Mosul. But the British responded, Jerusalem, Nazareth, and other places was a question apart, and affected various nations including Russia, and that this question could not now be gone into. The British issues were therefore pretty clear and well documented. They knew France needed to safeguard their historic and traditional position in Syria, and assure her of full opportunity of realising her economic aspirations in the Near East. Britain, though, wanted to assure her position in the Persian Gulf and develop Lower Mesopotamia, while they also said the Arabs require recognition of their nationality and their race from alien oppression, and an opportunity of re-establishing their position as a contributing factor in the world's progress. Where this Arab state would be, I've already discussed, but as a quick rundown, Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca, once claimed lands as far north as southern Turkey, but he began to surrender some claims, including possibly Iraq, for money. So the British were still open to handing it over to an Arab state, once saying to propose to the French government to throw Mosul into the Arab pool if we did so in the case of Baghdad. There was, in late 1915, even talk of the French scaling back their demands in eastern Syria, and the British were hoping they would hand over Lebanon to the Arab state as well. But then Mark Sykes entered into the equation. T.E. Lawrence described him as a bundle of prejudices, intuitions, half-sciences. He would sketch out in a few dashes a new world all out of scale. Sykes, for instance, came up with the idea of the EK line, stretching from Acre to Kirkuk. This would all fall under British influence, while the French would take Mosul and Erbil. Picot still demanded all of Palestine, but this was going to be placed under international administration and decided upon later with the Arabs and the Russians. Russia agreed to all these claims in April 1916 with their own agreement, and in return they would get control over Western Armenia. However, almost as soon as it was signed, the British War Cabinet believed it should be reviewed, and even Sykes began to distrust the French in Arab lands, saying, "The sooner the French military mission is removed from Hejaz, the better." William Ormsby Gore also wrote, "We are prepared to recognize the full sovereign independence of the Arabs of Arabia and Syria. It would seem time to acquaint the French government with our detailed pledges to King Hussein." He also went on to say that Damascus could be a possible capital city for a new Arab state. But more importantly, the British began to believe that French demands weakened the Arab cause, while France wasn't really even providing men in the Middle East. So there would be further discussions, and much of the Sykes-Picot Agreement would be negotiated again. Nevertheless, just 2 months after the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Arabs revolted, as Hussein's sons, Ali and Faisal, led an attack on the Ottomans in Medina. Although they had 50,000 men, most didn't have rifles, and they were promptly driven back. Hussein then, on June 10th, fired a gun from his window to begin an attack on the Ottoman garrison in Mecca, which were caught completely off guard. Fierce street fighting then ensued, and the Turks even accidentally set fire to the Kaaba during their bombardment of the city. The fighting carried on for days until the British sent Egyptian troops and modern artillery pieces to drive the Turks out of their forts. The new kingdom of Hejaz then took Taif in September, and British ships helped them take coastal towns like Jeddah and Yanbu. They then besieged Medina, but the Ottomans under Fakhri Pasha held out for years. This halted the Arab revolt for a while, but the British and French began sending advisors to the region, including T.E. Lawrence, and they instructed the Arabs to assault the Hejaz railway line. Many Arab prisoners of war were also sent to help the rebellion, most of which came from Iraq, including the future Prime Minister Nouri al-Said. The French also sent Claude Prost and Mohammed Ould Ali Raho. Rosario Pisani also brought a couple hundred North African troops, and as he was of Arab descent, he helped Lawrence mediate disputes in camp. Like during one raid alone, he settled 12 cases of assault, 4 camel thefts, 1 marriage settlement, 14 feuds, 2 evil eyes, and a bewitchment. Yet it wouldn't be until early 1917 that the Arabs could truly advance north. While this was going on, there were other developments in Arabia. The people of Oman continued to launch a religious rebellion under their imam, believing that the German Kaiser was a Muslim and on the verge of victory. And in 1915, the British also signed the Treaty of Darin with Ibn Saud. This treaty sort of turned the Saudi state into a British protectorate, and it also protected the British colonies as well. In exchange for this, the Saudis would receive money. However, this was the first time in Saudi history that borderlines were agreed upon. Yet there was a huge problem, as the Saudis never agreed to recognize the Sharif's rule over Mecca. With the new money and weapons though, the Saudis tried again to strike at Jabal Shammar, the ally of the Ottomans in Arabia. The Ottomans though helped Shammar crush the Saudis at Jarab, and during this battle, William Shakespeare, a British officer, was killed. He had been a military advisor for the Saudis since 1910, and some speculate if he didn't die, maybe the British would have supported the Saudis instead of the Sharif. But in the battle, Daydan bin Hithlain and his Ajam tribe refused to meet the Shammar enemy, and after the battle, they launched a rebellion against the Saudis. They though had long been a troublesome ally for the Saudis. Like going back to 1854, they rebelled against Faisal bin Turki and provided refuge to rival claimants to the throne. At this time, they largely lived in Al-Hassa, a land which the Saudis had just conquered in 1913, and they were raiding the lands of Mubarak of Kuwait, a supporter of the Saudis. Mubarak appealed to the Saudis to help stop them, and in June 1915, they met the Ajman at the Battle of Kanzan. The Saudis, however, were again defeated, and a brother of Ibn Saud was killed. Mubarak then began to criticize Ibn Saud as a leader to the British, but Mubarak died later that year and was succeeded by his son Jaber II. The Saudis were able to finally defeat the Ajman at Suwaydara. The Ajman then fled into Kuwait, where they were strangely protected by the new king, Jaber II. But Daydan bin Hithlain would come back and join the Ikhwan movement, a group of Islamists who believed that the Saudi rulers weren't going far enough. The Saudis, though, would continue to fight during the war. Like in 1917, they began to fall out with the new king of Kuwait, Salim, after he declared their protection over the Ajman. Small clashes ensued, but most of the conflict revolved around controlling caravans passing through Arabia. But, for now at least, the Saudis were halted on their advance. Meanwhile, the British were on the verge of gaining more allies within the Shamar tribe, including Sheikh Dari ibn Tawala, who headed the Aslam branch of the tribe, and Saud ibn Salah al-Subhan, the brother-in-law of the ruler. Now the British could possibly replace the leadership of the state with their own allies. However, the region was also claimed by many, including the Saudis. The India office, though, planned to draw in Euphrates tribes below Najaf and defeat bin Rashid, thus releasing bin Saud to move against Medina. Or Percy Cox wanted the Saudis and Shamar to unite and push north into the Euphrates. Otherwise, the start of the Arab Revolt helped alleviate the pressure on British Aden and prevented any real help coming to the rebels in Oman as well. Plus, given the turning tide in the region, Qatar also switched over to the British. They had, just a couple of years earlier, fought off the Ottomans and became largely independent. Then their new Sheikh Abdullah bin Jassim Thani forced the last Ottoman troops out of his country at the outbreak of war. And in November 1916, he signed a treaty of protection with the British, bringing his nation into the Trucial system. But the Entente were having problems elsewhere, particularly in North Africa. As the Italians joined the war to claim territory in the Mediterranean, this brought the Senussi order into the equation. Enver Pasha's brother and Jafar al-Askari went to Libya to meet the Grand Senussi and discuss the possibility of opening up another front in Egypt. Jafar would actually be one of the many Arab leaders who would turn against the Ottomans after Arab repression, and would be a future Prime Minister of Iraq as well. But for now, the Turks helped train the Senussi until, in late 1915, they struck at Egypt. The few British troops in Western Egypt fought the Senussi a couple times that December, in a campaign some survivors described as similar to the Boer War. So there were many raids and ambushes in a hostile environment. But it was only when the Gallipoli campaign ended that the British could finally throw more troops at the Senussi. Travelling on camels, planes and light armoured cars, they drove the Senussi back into the deserts, and by 1917, the uprising had largely been crushed. But the Germans had, even before the Turks, tried to make some sort of alliance with Ahmad Sharif, the leader of the Senussi. So maybe, if the Germans had won, there would be an independent Senussi state. Yet Ahmad abdicated during the war in favour of Idris, who would later be made king of Libya anyway. The Italians, tied up in Europe, decided to make a deal with him in 1917. This was the modus vivendi of Acroma, or in other words, they just agreed to live in peace with one another. Neither side recognised each other's claims, but neither side could win the war. So prisoners were swapped, Idris withdrew his support for Senussis in Egypt, and he was given arms to govern over his own lands. To the south of them, in Darfur, the British had helped Ali Dinar come back to power after they crushed the Mahdist rebellion. But he too decided to throw his support behind the Turks after their jihad, and his 10,000 soldiers, most of which were slaves, rebelled. Reginald Wingate was then tasked with leading an invasion force into Darfur to oust him. Poor supply lines stalled their march into Darfur, but planes dropped leaflets to encourage the population to denounce Ali Dinar and assure them that religious freedoms would be protected. By late 1916, they were defeating his forces quite easily. Like at Dibis, the slave soldiers charged at machine guns and aerial bombardments with spears. Finally, the British discovered Ali Dinar's body, already having been shot in the head. With that, the Darfur Sultanate came to an end, and it was absorbed into Sudan. But the French were having even more problems. In Morocco, the Zayan rebellion had been going on for years. There were even rumours of German involvement in the rebellion, so the French tried finally to destroy them. But at Gauss in 1918, they were crushed, and the rebellion continued until after peace was made in Europe. Otherwise, in 1916, the Kouachen revolt broke out in northern Niger. Their leader, known as Kouachen, led the Tuaregs in a jihad against the French colonists. Here they once again established links with the Senussi, and they completely caught the French off guard, as the Sultan of Agadez had assured the French that the people remained loyal. But really, he was working in coordination with the rebels. They quickly seized towns in northern Niger and threatened Algeria. But in early 1917, the French sent troops south and brutally crushed the rebellion. In some cases, they were even executing people in public. There was even a more serious threat to their rule further south, when, in the Volta Bani War, 20,000 people rebelled around Burkina Faso and southern Mali. They largely rebelled against conscription, but in the wider context of the war, they could well have succeeded and demanded more. But they again received no international support and were crushed. Yet, much of the war, in the Middle East anyway, was slowly turning against the Central Powers. Like Frederick Stanley Maude, was rebuilding British forces in Mesopotamia after their loss of Kut. In early 1917, he struck once again at Baghdad and issued a proclamation saying, "Our armies do not come into your cities and lands as conquerors or enemies, but as liberators." The Ottomans fled and began to refocus their defences on Mosul. The British, however, were divided over what to do with Iraq, as the governors of India and those in London fought over the future of the country. Percy Cox, for instance, wanted the Indian colonial government to take control of it, but the British government appointed Lord Curzon as the head of a committee to determine the future of Basra and Baghdad. They appointed governors along with Arab aides to the different provinces, but they were ill prepared for the challenges. For instance, their local police force, known as the Al-Shabana, was far too small for the role. Arnold Wilson then described the situation. Only the Nasiriyah district and that of Suk ash-Shuyuk were fully pacified. The vast majority of the inhabitants are tribesmen, warlike by nature, jealous of their freedom, and unwilling to undertake any manual labour not directly connected with agriculture. And his book called Loyalties of Mesopotamia talks of many smaller issues, like changing the sheikh's mind on using the Indian rupee, controlling prostitutes in Baghdad to stop diseases from spreading, and even the arrival of Japanese merchants in Basra selling Asahi beer, plus the epidemics of plague, smallpox, cholera, and the spread of malaria. One of the Shia leaders in Najaf, though, Atiya Abu al-Qualal, was receptive to receiving money and licenses to control trade. However, it became clear that he was only interested in money, and began smuggling Turkish goods into the city, so the British began to work on limiting his power. The British also asked the leaders of the city to feed members of the Aniza tribe, who arrived in late 1917. But the city was already suffering from a lack of food, and they actually stole goods from the new arrivals. The British were able to restore peace, but in the wake of this, a new political ideology began to emerge among the Shia people of Iraq. The League of Islamic Awakening was formed. Their leaders, people like Muhammad Bahar al-Alum, then led the group in a rebellion in March 1918. The British slowly surrounded the city to stop the rebellion from spreading and cut off their food and water. Inside, some Shia clerics, like Sayyid Muhammad al-Yazdi, began to work with the British to push for peace. Eventually they won out, and the rebellion ended without much violence. But the British would now have to deal with a host of different religious sects, tribes and the likes inside of Iraq. In this environment, they looked to form even more alliances. Like Gertrude Bell reported that the Aniza tribe, in the Syrian desert and Jazeera, may amount to 250,000 souls. But they were still largely nomadic, and deals had to be made with the various branches, so support could only be limited. Or there was Nuri bin Haza al-Shalan, who ruled over the Ruwala tribe. They had migrated to Syria after Wahhabi attacks, and Nuri had to kill his own brothers to secure leadership. He then managed to take over northern Arabia before the war, however he was exiled for attacking Ottoman officials. Then, in 1916, he returned to Syria and began to talk with T.E. Lawrence and Faisal. But he would only really join the Arab Revolt in 1917. There was also Sheikh Orda Abu Tayyi, the leader of the Howetat in Jordan. He had long been on the run from the Ottomans for failure to pay taxes, and approached the British for help. And there was Fayaz el-Fayez, the leader of the Bani Sakia. He held a secret meeting with Lawrence in June 1917, and as Ottoman persecution of Arabs intensified, he managed to unite his tribes in support of the British. So in many cases the Ottomans had made the situation worse for themselves. Jamal Pasha continued to persecute the Arabs in Syria or ignore their plight, during the Mount Lebanon famine. This disastrous famine in Lebanon was caused by many things, including an Entente blockade, the redistribution of crops to the front, and even the arrival of locusts. Yet the Ottomans still received a lot of blame. As the American consul wrote, "The streets are filled with starving women and children. The government is absolutely callous to the suffering of these poor people, nor will it allow the American Red Cross to assist them." So they began to deny aid, and mismanagement made the situation worse. Some went even further with their blame though. Lebanese writer Khalil Gibran said, "The famine in Mount Lebanon has been planned and instigated by the Turkish government. Already 80,000 have succumbed to starvation. The same process happened with the Christian Armenians and applied to the Christians in Mount Lebanon." Or the Times reported, "There is a new terrorization of the Arabic-speaking Muslims. It is estimated that from 60,000 to 80,000 have died of starvation in northern Syria." One often quoted piece of evidence was said by Enver Pasha, "We have done away with the Armenians by the sword. We will reduce the Christians of Lebanon by hunger." However, this quote is actually attributed to a Maronite priest working for French intelligence. Yet it does show some of the feelings the locals had for the Turks. In total, maybe over 200,000 out of a population of 400,000 died, while many of the survivors had to resort to cannibalism. Jamal Pasha would continue persecuting Arab leaders as well. Many were beaten and starved, flogged every day, or executed in public. Like on May 6, 1916, dozens of Arab leaders, MPs and journalists were executed in public squares in Damascus and Beirut. Today the sites of these executions are called Martyrs' Squares in both cities, and May 6th is known as Martyrs' Day. The persecution in fact got so bad that Faisal wrote to Jamal Pasha saying that for any Arab found killed, he would execute 10 Turkish soldiers. Many therefore continued to join the Arab revolt, including Ottoman officers, like Nuri as-Said and Jafar al-Askari, both of whom would be prime ministers of Iraq later on. So in 1917, the Arab revolt was on the move again, as Faisal led troops to Wedge. In March, the Ottomans, along with Ibn Rashid of Jabal Shammar, would try to stop their advance. But Sheikh Oda Abu Tayyi, along with Lawrence, then quickly took Aqaba in July. After this victory, the British in Egypt launched an offensive into Palestine and captured Beersheba. This campaign would have their greatest success in late 1917, when they took over Jerusalem. This then put the British in prime position to unite with a variety of other groups. Like Lawrence looked into aligning with the Druze in Lebanon, who had long rebelled against the Ottomans. Yet now with the British in Palestine, the future of this region came into question, and the British would announce the controversial Balfour Declaration, which set the stage for Israel becoming a state. In some regards, this could be seen as an attempt to get Jewish leaders on their side, as many in the British Parliament believed in the old anti-Semitic ideas of world Jewry and the likes. Even when Balfour himself was Prime Minister, he passed the Aliens Act, which limited the number of Jews that could migrate to England from Russia. Yet he did meet with Zionists in the past, like Chaim Weizmann. However, Balfour was initially more keen on establishing a Jewish homeland in Africa as part of the Uganda scheme, something Weizmann refused to consider. Now, some say that Weizmann almost single-handedly convinced the British to follow this path. Yet others speculate that with the notion of Jewish influence worldwide, the Balfour Declaration could have turned the tide of the war. The British believed Russian Jews could pressure the new Russian government to stay in the war and also pull the Americans in. As Balfour stated, the vast majority of Jews in Russia and America, as indeed all over the world, now appeared to be favourable to Zionism. If we could make a declaration favourable to such an idea, we should be able to carry on extremely useful propaganda both in Russia and America. Then there was also the possibility of creating an allied buffer close to the Suez Canal. After all, this had been threatened during the war, so it would be beneficial to the British. Weizmann, meanwhile, had connections with the Rothschilds, but this family was divided on the idea. Like Nathan Rothschild was opposed to Zionism, while Walter and James were far more keen. One member of the British Parliament as well also began to champion the cause, Herbert Samuel. He was a secular Jew who penned The Future of Palestine. In it he wrote the best solution believed by the leaders and supporters of the Zionist movement throughout the world would be the annexation of the country to the British Empire. Palestine had also not been mentioned in any discussions with the Sharif of Mecca, but early on, the plan was still to place it under international control. Sir Edward Grey then began to put forward the Zionist idea to his allies, arguing that Jewish colonists could grow strong enough to cope with the Arab population. They may be allowed to take the management of the internal affairs of Palestine, with the exception of Jerusalem and the holy places, into their own hands. But still, they got bogged down in discussions and no concrete plan came forward. So Sykes tasked Zionists like Nahum and Sokolov to persuade the French and Italians, and even the Pope. But still, the plan was far from concrete, as Kitchener continued to push for Egypt to take control of Palestine, with Jerusalem as a free city. And in his words, this would make Jewish infiltration into Palestine less obvious and annoying to the susceptibilities of the Muslim, and even certain elements of the Christian world. And when America entered the war, the Balfour mission to the United States brought the cause to Woodrow Wilson. In some of the records, it records the discussions. There was a very strong and enthusiastic organization, more particularly in the United States, who were zealous in this matter. To do nothing was to risk a direct breach with them. So the British pushed on, and after many drafts, they came up with the Declaration, which was deliberately vague. Like it called for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, making no real mention of size or geography. And Weizmann even said, "No reference must be made, I think, to the question of the suzerain power, because that would land the British into difficulties with the French." However, after the war, the Palin Commission reported that this vagueness caused many prominent people to make bold assertions. Wilson, Churchill, Teddy Roosevelt, Bonar Law, and others all made references to a Jewish state, and many papers called for a Jewish republic. But all of that was left to be discussed later on. There was, however, another threat of inaction, the possibility of Germany championing the cause. Balfour himself once stated, "The German government were making great efforts to capture the sympathy of the Zionist movement." And the British were sort of right in assuming the Kaiser was open to the idea of Zionism ever since his trip to Jerusalem in the late 19th century. But also German commanders were instrumental in protecting the Jewish population in Palestine. In April 1917, Jamal Pasha ordered that they evacuate Jaffa alongside many Christians and Arabs, believing that they would work alongside the advancing British. Tens of thousands were once again forced to march through the desert up north, and again many died of starvation. There were further plans to evacuate residents, yet as von Kress said, the terrible incident of the Armenian exodus would have been repeated, and we Germans would have again been made scapegoats for this senseless measure. The evacuation of a town in Turkey is tantamount to its complete annihilation. History will burden Turkey's allies with the responsibility of this act. So he stepped in and pressured the Ottomans to avoid any further deportations. Deportations had actually begun back in December 1914, and sometimes they targeted potential allies, like the future Israeli leader David Ben-Gurion. He had created a militia of 40 men to aid the Ottomans, but was sent to Egypt in March 1915. He still, however, sided with the Turks, and travelled around the world trying to recruit an army for them. However, the Zionist movement, as always, was divided. Like there was the Poale Zion groups, which had bases around the world. This group was founded in the Russian Empire, and hoped to turn Israel into a Marxist state. There was also the Her Haluts, or the Pioneers, which Ben-Gurion tried to recruit from. This was a Zionist youth movement, which tried to train would-be settlers in farming and the likes. Sometimes these movements overlapped, and sometimes not. So Ben-Gurion could not recruit many people, and when Balfour declared his support for a Jewish state, many Jews quickly switched allegiances and joined the newly formed Jewish Legion. It is said that out of the 5,000 members of this unit, a third came from America, a third from Palestine, 28% from the UK, and smaller groups came from Canada and even Argentina. And this group would see action in the Levant towards the end of the war. Now though, I've mentioned that Britain was trying to keep the Russians in the war. This is because in 1917, the February Revolution brought in a new government, and in the ensuing chaos, troops were being pulled out of Persia. The leader of the Assyrians, Aga Petros, continued to meet with the Russians in Urmia to discuss an independent state. But by now, the Russians in the region could barely put together an army. So as Russia was poised to leave the war, the British and the Italians met at St. John de Maurienne to discuss new claims. Here they agreed that France could take lands in southern Turkey like Adana, while the Italians would take Izmir and Antalya. However, at the same time, the Entente were also in negotiations with the Greeks, who, up until this point, had provided a base for Allied troops, but remained neutral. Inside Greece, Venizelos and the king were both divided on who to align with, and both ran sort of independent countries. Venizelos, for instance, allowed the Allies to land in the country and send troops across the border into the Macedonian front. But in 1916 the Romanians entered the war, and a panicked Bulgaria sent troops into Greece to defend their southern border. The pro-German king, however, told his troops to stand down, and the Greeks lost land. So the Allies helped topple the king and put Venizelos in power. He brought the Greeks fully into the war, and way back in 1915 he had actually been promised sections of Asia Minor by the British, but this was never really expanded upon. The Greeks, though, had long been wanting to expand east as part of their Megali idea. This would bring many regions that were majority or historically Greek under their rule. This would include Izmir and ideally Constantinople. And in the aftermath of the war, they would actually land troops in Izmir or Smyrna to claim it. Yet while in the west, the Macedonian front put pressure on the Ottomans, Bulgaria and Austria, in the east, the Bolsheviks would take power in Russia and pull them out of the war. In Russia, in the chaos between the revolutions, new nations started to appear, like Tapar Chermoyev declared the independence of the Muslim Mountainous Republic of the Northern Caucasus. South of them, the Russians had created the Special Transcaucasian Committee to oversee the region. But when the Bolsheviks took over, they began to act independently, ruling over Azerbaijan, Armenia and Georgia. They signed the Armistice of Erzincan with the Ottomans late in the year, but peace was never fully achieved. For instance, the Russian withdrawal had left the Armenians alone to defend themselves. And in January, they were accused of massacring Muslims, and the Ottomans began to advance once again. However, it's probably safe to assume that the Ottomans were more concerned with establishing some sort of presence in the Caucasus. As Rauf Bey said, they could consolidate the unity between kindred nations, not only historical and geographical, but rather ones of blood, flowing from their common past. They therefore hoped that the committee would formally declare independence from Russia and then enter into Turkey's sphere before the Bolsheviks re-emerged as a threat. And it should be said that the Germans hadn't agreed to full peace with the Russians, so they launched another assault in early 19, and finally they forced the Russians to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. With this, Russian claims to Istanbul and the likes were off the table, and many of the past agreements were declared almost void. However, in the peace treaties, the Ottomans were only able to take Kars and little bits of land in eastern Anatolia, which had all been agreed upon by the Germans. So Enver Pasha believed that all of his goals were ignored, and many like Ibrahim Haki Pasha were still worried about the Russians. As he wrote, although Russia may be in a weakened state today, it is always an awesome enemy, and it is probable that in a short time it will recover its former might and power. Enver therefore sent an army into the Caucasus, and fortunately for him, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had caused divisions within Transcaucasia. Some were happy to accept terms and surrender land to Turkey, but the Armenians in particular were not as keen. So hostilities broke out again in April, and the Ottomans demanded more lands, including Tbilisi. They arrived just a few kilometers from Yerevan and signed the Treaty of Batum, annexing further lands in the region. Once again, more crimes were reported, including the use of Armenian prisoners as bayonet practice, the enslavement of thousands of young men, villages were looted, and even their livestock was driven back to Turkey. The Transcaucasian Union, however, was already breaking down, as in March 1918, ethnic and religious clashes broke out in Baku. Members of the Azeri Musavat party promoted pan-Turkism, while the Bolsheviks began to infiltrate the countryside and gain a following. These Bolsheviks joined other non-Azeri militias and launched an attack on the Muslims, massacring up to 12,000 people during the March days. And in the aftermath of this, Muslims were expelled from Baku. The Bolsheviks therefore had taken power and created a commune. They then claimed the Musavat party had set the Tatar and Turkish populations, led by their reactionary bourgeoisie, against the Soviets, which consisted of Russians, with the support from the Armenians. The races began to slaughter each other in the streets, so the Azeris left the Union in May 1918. But they weren't the first to do so. In fact, the Georgians long believed that they should be an independent nation, and were worried about further Ottoman and Bolshevik encroachment, so they turned to the Germans for help. Although the Germans were still allied with the Ottomans, relations had grown worse, largely due to the oppression of Christians. Plus, a base in Georgia would allow the Germans to push east and control the oil in Azerbaijan, especially after the war. So Nowa Jordania, a Georgian Menshevik, approached the Germans for protection and declared independence. Armenia and then Azerbaijan then followed suit, while the Germans made their way to Tbilisi. They arrived in early June and actually clashed with the advancing Ottomans. Hans von Seeckt demanded that Enver Pasha withdraw his men, cutting off Turkey's route to Azerbaijan. So Enver tasked his brother Nuri with creating a new army, the Islamic Army of the Caucasus, and finding a new route via Persia. This army consisted of many Turks, Chechens, and Circassians, and together they advanced on Baku. However, the situation in Azerbaijan continued to grow even more complicated. The British had sent Lionel Dunsterville and his Dunster Force north to Armenia. On the way, he received support from Russians that had remained in Persia, like Lazar Becherikov. He commanded a few hundred Cossacks and made a deal with the Bolsheviks to help defend Baku from the Islamic army. This force, though, had to fight their way through quite a lot of land. Like in Gilan, Mirza Kuchuk Khan vowed not to let them past. His forces were being supplied by the Central Powers and were being trained by a German known as von Paschen. His armies were also bolstered with the arrival of many pro-Bolshevik Russians, but the British drove them out of Resht and pushed on. Meanwhile, British officers were sent to bring weapons to the Assyrians, who were still in Persia. They were trying to prevent the Ottomans from moving on to Tabriz, while the Allies continued into Azerbaijan. But in Baku, a group of left-wing leaders, including Mensheviks, led a coup against the Bolsheviks and created the Central Caspian Dictatorship. They asked the British for assistance and infamously arrested 26 leaders of the commune and had them executed. But the Islamic army was not stopped, and they conquered the city in September. Many Armenians tried to flee, but at the harbour, Ottoman troops massacred up to 30,000 of them, in revenge for the Azeri killings in March. The Islamic army then proceeded north onto Derbent and into the lands belonging to the Mountainous Republic. Here they remained, defending the Republic from any Bolshevik advances. So Bolsheviks, British, Islamic army soldiers, White Russians and independence groups were all fighting to claim the Caucasus, especially in Baku. To make matters even more complicated though, as the British pushed north, they got involved with the Russian Civil War. Over in Central Asia, thousands of German and Austrian prisoners of war were freed, and the Ottomans were on the advance. So Wilfrid Malleson was sent to the region to stop their propaganda attempts. The British also hoped to support the White Army, in this case the Trans-Caspian government. Malleson crossed the border and, with his largely Indian force, helped the Trans-Caspians occupy Merv, and they would remain in the region until after the war. But as foreign troops continued to pass through their lands, Persia continued to suffer. Food was being sold off to the foreign soldiers, major food-producing regions were turned into battlefields, and the transportation of crops became incredibly expensive. Droughts then struck the country, and famine followed. Looting became commonplace, and there are reports of cannibalism. To make matters even worse, foreign troops brought diseases with them, and typhoid in particular would strike the major cities particularly hard. Spanish flu would also arrive, killing somewhere between 8 and 20% of the entire population. Poor healthcare and understanding of diseases seemingly made the situation worse. Yet, it should be said, historians like Goli Majd, an Iranian, have deemed this famine and others to be a genocide. However, most people disagree with this, as there's no real proof of motive, and most of the deaths were caused by disease rather than famine. Yet, throughout it all, a more nationalistic sentiment began to grow. People flocked to join groups like the Gilan Jungle Movement, and the Qajar dynasty, which had left the country in this state, wouldn't rule for long after the war. Nevertheless, foreign troops continued to fight in Persia. Like the Assyrians under Aga Petros and Malik Kosheba, had been left in a volatile position ever since the withdrawal of Russia. In February 1918, they were ambushed by regional Persian forces, and clashes intensified in Urmia. The Assyrians fought in the streets and forced the Muslims within the city to surrender. But just a month later, they'd find even more enemies, like the Kurdish leader Simko Shakak. He had taken part in massacres of Christians throughout the war, and in March 1918, he assassinated Mar Benjamin Shamun, the patriarch of the Assyrians. The Assyrians retaliated and defeated him at Jarrah, and then they defeated a much larger Ottoman force at Suldoz. They would then proceed south towards Mosul, where they hoped to meet up with the British. As for Simko Shakak, he decided to launch a rebellion against the Persians, with an army that was probably stronger than the central government's. This rebellion would continue into the 1920s, and he has become a hero of Kurdish nationalism. However, by most reports, he was seemingly more concerned with plunder rather than establishing a national state. Also, the Armenians and Assyrians who had remained in Van after the Russians left finally decided to leave in early 1918, moving to Iraq and Persia. The Ottomans pursued and moved into Urmia in July, wiping out a number of them. So, in short, people continued to move freely across Persia's borders. However, all of this largely came to nothing. By late 1918, it was becoming more and more clear that the Germans were on the verge of defeat, and they pulled most of their troops from the Caucasus. The Ottomans were also growing more worried about the Macedonian front. After a long stalemate, the Entente launched the Vardar offensive and forced the Bulgarians to surrender in late September. Kaiser Wilhelm wrote to the Bulgarian Tsar saying, "Disgraceful, 62,000 Serbs decided the war." And partially this is true. The Serbians could push north alongside the French to liberate their lands in Albania, while the British and the Greeks marched east onto Istanbul. Meanwhile, over in Iraq, the British created a new force out of the Assyrians and Armenians. Together they took towns like Kifri, but really, the fighting had died down for a long time. With war coming to a close though, the troops in Iraq were told every effort was to be made to score as heavily as possible on the Tigris before the whistle blew. So late in October 1918, they made a huge push north to the Little Zab River. The French were also keen on establishing some sort of presence within the region and sent troops to fight in Palestine. Many of these troops, though, were from the French Armenian Legion, a force made up of refugees. And nearby, the Arab revolt continued to grow. Hurriyet al-Said attacked the Ottomans in Marne and forced the Ottomans into a full retreat. However, the Turks again began to massacre local populations, most notably at Tafas. Here, Lawrence of Arabia remarked how pregnant women had been assaulted with bayonets. He then addressed the Arabs saying, "The best of you brings me the most Turkish dead," and they would proceed to shoot enemies on sight, even those who surrendered. The British regular forces also advanced, winning a crucial victory at Megiddo in September. With this, the Ottoman army collapsed, and when the British arrived in Damascus, they found the locals had raised the flag of the Arab revolt, and Aleppo would then follow suit in late October. The Ottomans at this point had a new sultan, Mehmed VI, but he wouldn't rule for long. Talat Pasha visited Berlin and realized that the war was lost. He believed that the leaders must resign in order to secure a more favorable peace treaty. Enver then fled to Germany and would establish links with German communists like Karl Radek. Jamal Pasha would join him in Germany, and then he went on to Central Asia, and Talat himself resigned on the 13th of October. Ahmed Izzat Pasha took over the country and brought them out of the war with the signing of the Armistice of Mudros. He filled much of his cabinet with anti-war members of the CUP, and even allowed many of the deported Greeks to return to their often looted or occupied homes. Importantly though, the Ottomans allowed the Allies to occupy their lands in case of disorder, but essentially this just meant the Allies could place troops wherever they'd like. Some, however, still refused to surrender right away. Like in January 1919, Feyreddin Pasha still held out in Medina, but the Allies just bribed some soldiers and he was betrayed, allowing Abdullah, the son of the Sharif, to enter the city.